To help workers earn the skills they need to fill those jobs, we'll work with states to make high-quality preschool available to every child in America. And we're going to pay for it by raising taxes on tobacco products that harm our young people. It's the right thing to do.
That was the president on Wednesday rolling out his budget plan. And one of the novel items in that plan is the near doubling of the federal cigarette tax to $1.95 per pack. It is estimated to raise about $8 billion a year over the next decade. And that money will be used to pay for early childhood education. Just as we call the budget a moral document, so too is our tax code. So, Josh, I wanted to ask about this because there were two, what I felt like were very kind of like ethical claims that the president was making. One is we're going to take smoking, which is bad, and pay for early childhood education, which is good.
Right.
And we're going to institute the Buffett rule, which he presents as a kind of ethical claim on the fair share.
Right. Well, I think both of these are really problematic ways to finance the federal government. On cigarette taxes, it's the most regressive major tax that governments in the United States levy. It is quite effective in reducing smoking rates. It causes fewer people to smoke, and importantly, it also causes people to smoke less. But a problem that creates is that it's a declining source of revenue. As the cigarette tax works and gets people to quit smoking, the revenues taper off, and so you end up saying we're going to have the cigarette tax and it's going to pay for this program, and over time, the revenues become insufficient to pay for the program. I also think if something like universal pre-K is of a lot of value, you ought to be able to make a case to the public that they should be willing to finance it with a broad-based tax. And I think this is a general problem with the way the president talks about taxes, where he comes in and says, we're going to have a major expansion of the federal government, we're going to create a universal health care entitlement, but someone else will pay for it. 98% of the country should, with the exception of the cigarette tax, not be responsible for paying any of the bill for these expansions of government. And I think that's a problematic message. If government is doing good things for the public as a whole should be expected to pay for it.
It's the kind of World War II notion, right? That, even if you weren't on the front lines, that being part of the war effort at home meant recycling, it meant conservation, right? That we would all be part of it. Right. And yet, what we know is that as a matter of politics, it hasn't been very easy to make those kinds of claims. Right. Even when people want a good, they're not very willing to see an increase in taxes to pay for it.
Well, this is a way to kind of raise taxes by tying it to morality. Who's going to say no to raising taxes on cigarettes instead of, like you're saying, addressing the real problem is that we do definitely need something very, very different for this. And instead of smoking, it could be toking. Let's tax marijuana. Let's make that something. But you got to find it some other way.
Right, legalize marijuana and then tax
There's a lot of money to be made.
Then it's not so much a declining situation. Get some more items in there to tax.
Well, I think what cigarette smoking seems to be morally, somehow worse than something like that. But to tie it to that means it's going to go through on both sides.
Yeah. But actually, on this point about people not being willing to pay taxes for things, it's interesting. National Academy for Social Insurance did some polling a month or two back where they asked people would they be willing to pay higher taxes, higher payroll taxes for Social Security. And overwhelmingly, people said yes across the political spectrum. And it was really striking. And I've just sort of been struck because I've raised this point. I've looked at their poll. I've talked to them. I think it was a very serious poll. And I've raised this in conversation, I don't know how many times, and people just literally ignored it. I was just on a radio show last week with several other people, and they said, well, what are we going to do about Social Security? I go, okay, look, in short term, there's no big deal. Somewhere down the road, sure, we need to do something. One thing we could do, I'd say raise the cap, but you can have a higher payroll tax. And then the other people on the show said, we can't keep evading the problem. So it's just like I hadn't even said anything.
But I think this is an interesting one because the payroll tax is the one place where you are sort of getting, what that particular tax is paying for, right? So your overall withholdings, you're not completely sure. But just like property taxes, you're pretty darn clear about what your property taxes are paying for. With the payroll tax, we know what it's paying for, but I do feel like there's a kind of obscurity around it. Like, I have to say, coming from a relatively working class household, I didn't know that high incomes capped out. Like, I didn't know there was a point at which you stopped paying payroll taxes. And the first time I ever earned enough, it was like in November, and I was, 32 or something, and I was like, my check is too big. It should be smaller. I just had no idea, and it felt to me like, well, this seems like the easiest tax-based solution I've ever heard. Everybody pay all year.
Right, and consistent with that, the Social Security Administration says that if we raise the Social Security tax to 7.65%, we'll close the gap. cap. So we know that the Social Security Trust Fund will top out in 2033, and this will close the fund, and there's support for that. But the backlash is always, well, we've got to reform it now. We've got to reform it in a certain way. But I think it's going to take a mix of measures, at least.
But it is the one place where at least we see some indication of people's willingness to pay more in taxes. Let me also ask about this. The notion that we use taxes to create certain kinds of behaviors or to keep certain kinds of behaviors from happening, is that a reasonable way to use our tax code? Or should we just go to the most simple, like everybody with this income at 10%, everybody this income with 30%? Is it reasonable to use our tax code as a moral document?
I think it can be reasonable to do that, but we do too much of it, and we do it in the wrong ways. I mean, sometimes it's the really efficient way to achieve social changes that we want. For example, a carbon tax is a very clean and elegant way to reduce carbon emissions that's a lot more economically efficient than doing much more specific regulatory approaches where you try to tell people what specific times they ought to be emitting carbon and where. But I think there's a tendency for the tax code to get politically captured. And so you get things like the mortgage interest deduction that aren't really producing greater social efficiency. They're just producing benefits for certain incumbents that value the fact that their tax bill is held down.
That's an incredible waste. I'd give one that my favorite, I'm saying this in part as an employer, the cafeteria plans. That we're a small place, but people want it, so we have that in there. Now, the amount of money you save by putting aside, say, $1,500, $2,000 a year, the amount of money you save on taxes is so small compared to the administrative expenses involved. And invariably, you get people at the end of the year, they're sitting there with $700 and go, oh, what am I going to do? I know people that go buy glasses, they have a prescription, they get what a waste.
I stopped doing that. When I was an employee, not a business owner. I would just fill out all these forms, and there was a point where I reached the point and I go, my time is money, and this is not worth my time. So it is a really crazy process every year when I go and talk about the FSA and all of this, and here's the paperwork, and it just sounds just so much. So there's a point where this is just too much time spent. There was a great op-ed today. If you calculate the tax code, how much time we all spend on taxes, by $20 an hour, and it goes out to $180 billion a year that we spend in time. Cut that in half. That's $90 billion that we spend going through paperwork
to try to make the taxes happen. When stay here, because when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the Social Security thing. That was the other big news out of the White House this week, and whether or not we're going to save the safety net with chained CPI when we come back.